Today I'm going to try and shed some light on the process of writing piano transcriptions. I'm thinking here mainly of transcriptions of orchestral music, but really these ideas apply to other genres, even outside of classical music. I'm also assuming you have access to the orchestral score. Transcribing music without the score is a whole separate skill unto itself, and I'll save that topic for another time. But assuming you have access to the original score, well, you've got to be comfortable reading orchestral scores. That means, for example, knowing how to read alto and tenor clefs, knowing all the Italian or French or German names of the instruments, and knowing which instruments are transposing instruments. For example, piccolos sound an octave higher than written, basses sound an octave lower than written. A trumpet in E flat means that written C sounds the E flat above, and horn in E flat means that a written C sounds the E flat below. I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but if you are curious, a good reference is this book, Treatise on Instrumentation by Hector Berlioz, revised by Richard Strauss, two of the great orchestral writers of all time. This book will not only tell you how to read orchestral scores, it will give you a lot of insight into why composers choose which instruments for what parts of their music. So the obvious and naive way of transcribing an orchestral piece is to just copy the notes verbatim from the original onto a piano staff. And this works for simple passages, but more often than not, you'll find that you simply don't have enough fingers to play literally what's in the original. There may also be musical reasons for removing or adding or changing around the notes. So the real fun in writing transcriptions is figuring out what to do in these situations when you can't just copy the notes verbatim. And for examples of how such problems can be solved, there is no better place to start than with the grand master of piano transcriptions himself, Franz Liszt. Yeah, I know, that's not a transcription, whatever. You know, Liszt is popularly remembered as something of a showman and a womanizer, and I suppose that's partly true, but there was so much more to the guy, and he was by no means a shallow-minded person. I mean, man, Liszt spent so much time and effort promoting other composers and their works. And one of the ways he did this was by writing piano transcriptions of their compositions and playing them for audiences that probably wouldn't get a chance to hear them played by a full orchestra. One of the very first transcriptions that Liszt published was of the Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz. Berlioz described his symphony as depicting an episode in the life of an artist who is driven mad with love and overdoses on opium and subsequently has a series of musical hallucinations where the girl he has a crush on appears as a recurring melody. Basically, the symphony is Berlioz's all-too-public display of infatuation with the Irish actress Harriet Smithson, whom he subsequently married, but alas, that marriage fell apart rather quickly. When the symphony was first performed, it caused quite a sensation. Audiences loved it, but it was a rather polarizing work among musicians, some of whom felt this is so cool, and some of whom felt this is so stupid. Well, Liszt was one of those that felt it was pretty cool. He was only 19 or 20 at the time, and that was 8 years younger than Berlioz. But he had already established himself as a minor celebrity. And not only did Liszt himself pay for the publication of Berlioz's symphony, but he wrote a piano transcription of it and played it at his recitals. Bit of trivia, when Robert Schumann wrote his review of the Symphonie Fantastique, he was using Liszt's piano score as his reference. Let's look at the fourth movement. This is the famous March to the Scaffold, where the protagonist has supposedly poisoned his lover in a fit of jealousy and is condemned to die, and he's being led off to his execution with crowds of spectators lining the streets. This is pretty simple so far. What does Liszt do with it? exceptions. To begin with, the timpani are playing these two notes. Liszt doubles them an octave lower, and that's a typical way of rendering timpani on the piano. Either transpose them down an octave or double them an octave below, just to give them a bit more body. Then later on, Liszt makes the timpani jump between two different octaves. This does not happen in the orchestral score, and I think Liszt is just having fun here and spicing it up a bit. Then he adds octaves in the right hand. Now this is a very unusual treatment of timpani, to have octaves in both hands. But it does work in this passage, because you see, the sensation you get from the orchestra is being deafened by these ominously approaching drums. And that's what Liszt manages to preserve. Finally, he lands on this chord. Now what's in the orchestral score is this, where the top note is a B flat rather than a G. And I cannot come up with any musical justification for this. So I personally think that this is either an oversight on Liszt's part or just publisher error. Moving on a bit, things start to get interesting. Okay, so now we've got the high strings. We've got the low strings. And the timpani pounding away. And we are now clearly in not enough fingers territory. Liszt is going to have to give something up. He decides to give up the timpani, but he lets us hear it for one measure where there's not much else going on, and then he actually writes the timpani part under the piano part, as if to say, just so you know, this is what's going on in the orchestra, but you're not going to be able to play these notes, so don't even try. Okay, now what's going on in that last measure? A more faithful transcription would have been this. But instead, Liszt moves the timpani up to a very un-timpani-like register, and he moves this chord all the way up here. What is he up to? I think this is why Liszt did that. You see, in the orchestra, Berlioz gives you a surprise flourish by suddenly bringing in the brass, fortissimo, after you've gotten used to hearing just strings for a while. Now, on the piano, you don't have as broad of a color palette to play around with, but you can still get surprise flourishes by suddenly covering a lot of ground on the keyboard. And if you want brilliance, higher is better. So I think that's what Liszt was trying to do, and it feels very naturally pianistic. Okay, let's look at a really complicated passage. All right, let's break this down. We've got the high wind instruments. Violins. Violas and cellos. Basses. Trombone. Tubas. Timpani. It's almost as if Berlioz was trying to write an untranscribable piece. What is Liszt going to do? What he does is something that would never have occurred to me. Not only does he simplify the passage, he rewrites the texture completely. So all of those orchestral details are just swept away, and you're given the melody and the harmony presented in this pounding triplet rhythm, which does not come across in the orchestra. Now, if I had been transcribing this piece, my instinct would have been to try and preserve some of those rushing figures in the strings, even if I have to transpose them around a bit. Maybe something like this. Is my way or Liszt's way more correct than the other? Not necessarily, it depends what kind of effect you're looking for. But Liszt's approach does have this advantage. It preserves that sense of terrifying power that you get from the orchestra playing the whole piece, so it fits really well. Liszt was always coming up with imaginative solutions like this, but there was at least one time when he could not make up his mind between three possible solutions. This is not in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, but in Richard Wagner's Liebestod. Wagner was another one of those composers whom Liszt was constantly championing. Liszt wrote a whole bunch of transcriptions of Wagner excerpts, including Isolde's Liebestod from Tristan und Isolde. The word Liebestod means literally love-death. Now, Wagner was quite adamant that the prelude to the opera should be called the Love-Death, and the finale, where Isolde basically sings herself to death over Tristan's dead body, should be called the Transfiguration. But Liszt missed the memo, and when he wrote his transcription of the finale, he called that the Love-Death. And because Liszt's transcription spread faster than the opera itself, his terminology stuck, so everyone today knows the finale as the Liebestod. I said there was a place where Liszt couldn't make up his mind between three solutions. It's at the climax of the Liebestod. I couldn't find a good quality recording of the original with orchestra and singer that is in the public domain, but if you want to hear it, you can probably find it on YouTube. Here we approach the climax of the Liebestod. Now what happens next in the orchestra is, well, several things, but the overall effect is of long, sustained, rich, and full major sixth chords spanning the entire range of the orchestra. And of course, long, sustained chords are something you cannot do on the piano. I'm an organ. I'm sustaining these chords. They are definitely not dying away right after I hit them. Yeah, nice try, sorry. So Liszt came up with three possible solutions. Number one, repeated chords. Number two, like number one, but with some arpeggios. Number three, tremolos. And he couldn't make up his mind which was best, or maybe which was least objectionable. And ultimately, all three got published in the score together. Now in number two, I think the arpeggios are actually a bit distracting. And as for number three, tremolos are a useful effect, but they can start to sound really cheesy after a while. And Liszt did use a whole bunch of tremolos earlier in his transcription. So most pianists end up picking the first option, where it's just repeated chords. So those are some of the ways in which Liszt rendered orchestral music into pianistic terms. It's rather like translating a work of literature from one language to another and having to deal with all the different idioms and colloquialisms. You do inevitably have to take liberties here and there, but what matters is that the end result is musically convincing as a piano piece. Hope that was informative. If you're curious, you can check out some of my own piano transcriptions at this link. That's all for today, friends. See you next time.